Hello and welcome to the 31st Documentary Film Festival in Munich. My name is Seggen Mikael and I will be your host for this evening. Today, DOK.network Africa presents its 7th Africa Day here, and tonight we will have the panel discussions with 3 beautiful panelists. But first, I want to introduce you to the 3 curated films that are going to be shown during the Africa Day. You can see them on our website through the film program, and you can watch all 3 films. But to quickly introduce you to those films, I will show you now a cut trailer of them.
Mimi kuzaliwa kwangu nilizaliwa mwaka wa 1925. Mimi hata sijui huko kwanza vibaya kwake. Sasa wanasema ni mimi ni mchawi, nimewaroga. Na mimi nililia sana tena.
Niliona message kwa Facebook group. Kazi zangu wakaanza kusema na mzee katika familia yanaua watoto wa wenzake.
Piriwa baya akosa panga temwe haya ti abuke malazi haha sikano ba aziremzi.
Hapa kwetu wasaa shamba ndio ambao watoto wanaipenda sana.
Fela na olakatsa jwang o ka bona le China le na le motibo le disa jalo ka Mosotho bana a dula le Sotho utlwaeka ke ntwe ka banjwang utlwaeka o tla ba a moetse boemo ba rona kapa o lakatsa jwang o ka bona Mosotho ana le wholesale jalo ka le China a tleide a le boemong bo phameng re rata hore bontate ba ma China ke ba twisia ka ntle ba re rute gona ba isa di wholesale jwa jwale le gona tla se bo ba ruta gona di kgomo di etsa jwang ka ba ruta ntho tsa gona bona bele ba tsebotse ba bele ga kopana le bona mme jwale ha re ya mo ile ma China he lona he ga rute ba tle ba tsebe lo ithoka mohloma ka ukwa re China se le ithoka le bolela ka mogole ka bolelang ka teng e tla be le go kene hantle mo re mo batlang se ke tla molata ntate mo wa le China mona ke mo tshwallaka ke ratle mona re se ale mo mona ke mo jweso ga hey ke tla bua se China be ke tla e le bolela ho jwalo he mogatu ya waka dintho di jwalo he mmamedi wa motho FM he ke bona
شوف بدك يجي واحد بدك يجي عند الله هنا.
أنا أول مرة أشوف مرة دايرة قهوة هنا في
لا وعيني أنا كانت تجيب
شعارها ثورة من الشعب وبفائدة الشعب. هذا نزور الشيخ
هاي نشوفه في الدنيا صحة طويلة وسطيعة كبيرة.
DOK.network Africa is about conversations at eye level between Africa and Europe. So tonight we're going to be talking about documentary filmmaking per se, and exchanging ideas between the continents. So now I can finally introduce you to our guests. We have with me Maia, Lekow, and Christopher King, who are the directors of The Letter. They're on the bottom left here. Hi, Maia, and hi, Chris.
Hi.
Hi, thanks for having us, Seggen.
Then we have Teboho Edkins, who's the director from Days of Cannibalism on the bottom left, on the upper left here. Whoops, here. And then we have with me Tiny Mungwe. She's right under me, who's a producer at Steps in South Africa. Hello, nice to welcome you.
Hi, nice to be here.
To our audience tonight, please don't be shy. This is as much for you as it is for us. So we want to introduce you to ask questions anytime you feel you want to ask someone specific or just the panel in general. Feel free to just jump in and ask questions on Facebook Live. You can find the link on our Facebook website. So before we jump right in, just wanted to ask you, how are you guys? How is the situation right now for you during this little pandemic? Whoever wants to start, Teboho maybe.
Hi. Well, I'm in Berlin at the moment. It's raining. So far, I haven't. I'm sort of. I don't go out very much, but we can walk around. We can go exercising, so it's not so bad. It's a bit strange taking part in all these festivals online, but at least I get to see many more films than I would if I went to a festival in person.
And for you, Maia and Chris, how are you guys?
Yeah, no, it's been obviously strange times like everybody. But we luckily, kind of we're in that space where we have enough time to edit this new documentary, which we didn't have enough time to do before. So that's been really lucky. In terms of like the outside space of Nairobi, we're in the current lockdown. And yeah, we're just trying to do the best we can.
And for you, Tiny?
So I'm in Durban, South Africa. I usually work in Cape Town for Steps, but we have had to work from home due to the kind of lockdown restrictions that have been happening in South Africa since late March. So our numbers are somewhere around 7,000 cases, 7,000 to 8,000 cases of coronavirus that have been from positive test. And we, since the first 3 weeks of lockdown, have kind of gone into a kind of like a phased like system or structure of lockdown. So the first original lockdown where you cannot move was level 5. And now we're in level 4 where there's some more essential services that are available. But a lot of people are, losing jobs in a lot of industry, especially like hospitality and like food, like restaurants are closed and things like this. A lot of people are uncertain about, the jobs that they will have after COVID, whenever that will be. And I think it's a really difficult time for a lot of people in South Africa, and I think other societies where there's a lot of inequalities. So we at Steps are producing a project right now with filmmakers from all over the continent, and it's different levels of panic and also different levels and different like types of responses that are happening. But I think like for the filmmaking community that I'm working with, it's about thinking about how firstly filmmakers can survive and find ways to earn a living in the interim, but also thinking about how filmmakers can respond to this in a situation where you can't go out and film, where it's not safe to go out and film. So it's an interesting and an uncertain time, like everyone else on this call. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you for your insight. I think that was one of the main reasons why we wanted to do this festival still online, because we thought all like the prize money and all this, the documentaries otherwise would have not have another platform, some of them at least that we are showing. And we were kind of making a sign that documentary is still a crucial thing to show, and it can give you a certain insight that other films can't. And even in this time, we shouldn't just dismiss it. We should still be trying to bring like our art forward. So this Africa Day, the theme, as I said, was Pan-Africanism. And so looking at the Africa Day editions before, we were only showing films from Sub-Saharan Africa. And we got some feedbacks from viewers, like, why are you not including Northern Africa? Why is it not part of the Africa Day? So this year, we also have a Follow the Nile project with fellows from East Africa and Northern Africa. Unfortunately, Hassan Farhani couldn't make it. He's from Algeria. He would have been our North African film director, but we tried to include North African movie, and that's why this theme is Pan-Africanism. So I just, maybe for some of our viewers, the term itself is not known or doesn't, they don't know exactly what it means. So I just wanted to know, what is Pan-Africanism for you? Tiny, maybe you can start. What does it mean in your own, for yourself, or like what?
I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it for myself as a special answer to myself. And I'm not sure that I get to define it for myself. Like, I'll just say what I understand it, like from my education, to whatever extent that is. And that is, it's a post-colonial intellectual, political, and cultural movement, which is about finding ways to build solidarity, so finding ways to also like overcome like identities that have been imposed and structures that have been imposed by colonialism, finding a way to overcome those things through solidarity across the African continent, but also across the African diaspora, wherever that may be. So people who went to America on the transatlantic slave trade, people who are living in the diaspora through like the European diaspora, through whatever historical connection. It's about how to find that solidarity and build a new like identity and new kind of ways of connecting with each other in the post-colonial context.
I think I just add, sorry Teboho, and just adding to what Tiny is also just saying is that I think all of those things that you just said, but it's also like across Africa, like how is it that people are really like joining together during those hardships, during things that a lot of different African countries were feeling at the time or fighting for, and how does that kind of band together to create something that is African?
Yeah, Teboho?
Yeah, sounds good. I was just wondering, what about Africans who are living outside the continent?
That's the diaspora.
That's the diaspora.
But you know, I mean, I think it would be nice for us in this conversation to problematize that, right? Because I think problematizing it is the thing that leads us more all the time into more connections, into more, because also the other thing is that understanding your history is a byproduct of the kind of cultural products that you're consuming, books, stories like comics, and then films, which have always been historically, because of this inequality, being told from a certain perspective. So as artists, like trying to find out, well, how do we define Pan-Africanism is an opportunity to find so many people that we have links to that we don't know about, because we are just beginning to tell our stories.
And to say in a broader sense, you can also define the diaspora as Pan-Africanistic, because we stem from Africa, but we live somewhere else. So we still have those ties to the continent and to the stories of the continent. So to kind of go back into that history, when the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers in the 1970s was founded, their reason, or like they used film as a tool of liberation. That's what they say, from being colonized in a country. They kind of used films as telling their own stories towards a complete African unity. Teboho, why did you make Days of Cannibalism? Like, what was your reason? Why did you become a filmmaker? Like, why did you want to make film?
Well, I've been making film. Right now, I don't think I could do anything else, unfortunately. I mean, for me, filmmaking has come from more of the craft perspective. You know, I studied art, so it was all about the actual making of the film rather than what I wanted to say with the films. You know, it was about the material at first. So that's how I began filmmaking by working with video installations, by kind of understanding image and what image meant in space, and it was more from a craft perspective, I guess. And I've been making films for, I don't know, 15 years now, and I think, I don't know, I just honestly, one film just leads to the other. I don't, step back. I just sort of go with the flow. I don't have an overwhelming objective that my films are meant to change the world, or that I don't think that my films are going to create a revolution, but maybe they can observe the revolution.
Mm-hmm. And for you, Maya and Christopher, why are you making films, and like why making films together, maybe?
I think the reason for us is because, like, for example, this first feature-length documentary that's also showing at DOK.fest, The Letter, for me is that it's a story from my hometown, from when my father's mom was born. And a lot of films, actually no films, I don't think have been made from that area. And for me, it was like just one of those things where it was important to tell this story. Whether it can change something on a wider thing, I don't know. It might, it might be able to create discussion, but other than that, I'm not sure. But for me, the most important was to be able to just tell the story from where my family's from, to be able to understand more my roots, because I was also born in Nairobi, far from this Kilifi area, and to be able to share the stories from there as an African musician and filmmaker. And Chris and I have been married for 15 years, a long time. No, we've been together for 15 years, I lie.
Yeah, so I think like making films together, it's I guess intensely personal by default, because it's just the two of us out when we're filming, and I don't know. We just we knew we wanted to go on this journey. We didn't know where it would lead. Over 6 years, we just kept following this rabbit hole that that ended up somehow in a finished film, thankfully. But I think at the time, I guess because it's our first film, we didn't really know what we were doing. And so we just kept following it. And thankfully, like, we're able to make something of it.
What I think documentaries can do also very well is that they can like break the single story of a place, a country, or a culture. So what I found interesting that in Days of Cannibalism, there was like, at the beginning when I like just saw the trailer, it kind of seemed like the Chinese are coming and they're taking over Lesotho, and then you like watch the film and you find out about like the different families, and you have much more detail to the story. So it's not like the Chinese are coming or taking over. It's more of a you see kind of behind a generalization. What was your objective behind doing the film? Were you kind of already interested in this mix of culture, like the clash of culture, or?
Yes, that was one of the reasons. I mean, I began making the film when I was living in Hong Kong at the time, and I heard about African traders visiting Guangzhou and coming to stay in Guangzhou in China and doing business there. And so I went and I stayed with them and I lived with them for a couple of weeks. And that's kind of when the idea began. And then I sort of understood that the Chinese going to Africa to do business is sort of the other side, the other side of the coin. And while I made the film, these things that these impressions you're talking about, the sort of like the Chinese are coming and kind of generalizing the Chinese and thinking of it as some sort of neo-colonial takeover. I mean, these are all kind of vague thoughts that I had or that I kind of observed in other people around me. And the more time I spent with the Chinese community, I understood that these are also just people who are trying to make a living, So there's no the Chinese, but there are many different types of Chinese who have different types of agendas, or who have different, who want to survive in different ways. So I think when I make a film, I often don't have a specific objective at the beginning, but it grows within me as I make the film. My films also try to show this process of understanding. My films are often about the process of saying something or understanding something, and I try to make that kind of very obvious in my film. Like with my previous films, I made these previous films, these gangster films in Cape Town, and they're all about, as I make the film, I understand what filmmaking is about, So this sort of process of understanding what you're trying to say within the film is something I really like to, that's the kind of the way I like to work.
And Tiny, you talked about doing this Pan-African film project and generalization. How did you choose your protagonists for the film, or how did you get in contact with them? And how difficult is it to do like this project all over the continent?
So just to clarify, Generation Africa is a project of steps, which is a collection of films from 17 countries on the continent, which are talking about the topic of migration. So, we put out a call to both the Anglophone and Francophone community in Africa, which are two very separated communities. We put out a call for people to submit stories about migration, but stories that were, kind of not playing to a narrative about Africa, and specifically a narrative about Africa from the perspective of migration. Stories that were kind of challenging that narrative, and they were also showing narratives of hope, agency and action, which you don't see a lot of in documentary storytelling in Africa. And again, because there aren't many opportunities for African filmmakers to tell stories, but also to tell stories for a global audience. So our approach to selecting these stories was in also acknowledging that Africa is not a country, it's not one monolithic thing, and that there are many varied experiences, and also there's nuance and complexes into this narrative about what Africa is about. Why make these stories? Because Africa is increasingly becoming an important part of the world, or a continent that kind of has the possibility to kind of affect the future, not just of us living here on the continent, but also of the world, and the basket, the place where all the resources come from, but also the place where all the young people of the continent, the youth of the world, will come from in the future. So it was important to tell those stories, and again, like you were saying in your question, to ensure that there's that these stories are character-driven, and therefore giving people an insight into personal stories of what people are doing and achieving in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And when choosing an aesthetics for your film in general, are you going with what you are filming? So you're looking at what material you have and then you choose a style, or are you thinking beforehand what kind of images you want to portray? Maybe Maia and Christopher, you can start.
I think as Chris kind of mentioned, for our first film, we really didn't have a clue on so many different levels. So essentially we just started filming, and we just filmed everything and had way too many hours of footage. And we didn't actually even watch the footage until much, much later. So I think that's a terrible excuse in terms of aesthetics. I'm thinking essentially, how this film is going to play out. I think for this next film, we've really now learned from the first one, and we've been able to really think as to how do we want to tell this story. And I think for us, it's over a series of time. Essentially, it's obviously meeting the characters, doing the research of the space that we're focusing on, and then figuring out through that space how many different ways do we want to tell this story, and what would be the most effective.
I think the style that we ended up as well came a lot out of I think some of the labs and a lot of the mentorship we received, as first-time filmmakers. We would get feedback on footage and just see what resonated with people. We also had the opportunity to be a part of the first cohort of filmmakers through the DOK.box East African Film Fund, and I guess through that we were with 6 other film projects, and seeing their films also develop. I think seeing Pete Morimi and I Am Samuel, which is about to premiere at Hot Docs, we kind of came up at the same time, and seeing the way he could put scenes together in such a personal way, I think he inspired us to kind of go back to where we were filming and go deeper and be more like, yeah, just closer and more intimate. And yeah, just being inspired by other filmmakers, Teboho as well, together in Toronto, and just like seeing other filmmakers in their process, I think was like a huge inspiration.
It's true. Sorry, that was our neighbor's dog. It has now left.
So the community is really important, right? Maybe that's what Pan-Africanism is also about.
So talking about community and having, if I will be a filmmaker, I have an idea for a film. Now I'm looking for funding, right? If you look at documentaries now being funded, a lot of it, like for example, Hassan Fahani's documentary was funded by France. A lot of times you see that the documentaries from the African continent are funded by the former colonizing countries. How independent would you say the African film market is, and what kind of steps need to be taken to get more independent?
Tiny, that's for you.
Hi. So I mean, so I think I don't understand this notion of like independent film, and I think because I didn't like start doing film in America where that makes sense in the context of a studio. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I really think possibly the only independent thing is like, you know, your wedding video, that's independent. Yeah. Like no one is making films out of their own pocket. Right. So it means that to make film, you have to play to some kind of a funding source, firstly. And secondly, I think it's also very important to acknowledge that we are making like artistic films. We are trying to make artistic films in an environment where we are living through a cultural hegemony that makes it difficult for our films to find an audience in the first place, right? So these are the conditions in which we're working, like globally, not just in Africa. Like we're all making the type of films where we're up against whatever's on Netflix. Sorry, Netflix. But yeah, we're up against that, and we're making films that are trying to express something else. So earlier when you were talking about aesthetic, like as a producer, I'll say that like in documentary on the continent, most of the funding for making films which are factual, which are following real lives, are like NGO funding for messaging and that kind of like angle. Documentary films which seek to find an audience globally are funded in very complicated ways. So in thinking about where the money for films comes from and saying, why is it that this funding comes from the West, is then asking us to interrogate a lot of other history, not in the film sector, but about how the money in the world works, right? And if we're to interrogate this, I think then we're going to start making films about this. And maybe it would be interesting to do that, right? But anyway, that's not the point. I think there's an understanding everywhere else in the world, in films that are made everywhere else in the world, that films are made through cooperation and co-production, right? And really what I think the conversation should be is, what is the basis for collaboration and cooperation in order to make films for the whole world?
Mm. Yeah. I mean, as a sort of simple filmmaker, this funding, you know, sort of, it becomes kind of a, the nationality of my film kept changing, you know. At one moment it was a French film, and then it became a Dutch film, and it's supposed to be a Canadian film. It actually was a South African film, but, you know, it was actually a Sotho film, or Lesotho film rather. It becomes quite bizarre, because each country has their own, you know, rules, you know. So for instance, to get Hot Docs money, the film had to be a South African film. But the Hot Docs money was not enough to make the film, and you don't get enough money from South Africa, so we had to go to France to get the film, to get some more money. But then were we still allowed to get the Canadian money, because it ceased to be a majority South African film. But if we kept a co-production, you know, one kind of comes into these really complicated labyrinths, you know, just to get the money. So I don't know, I'm supremely practical when it comes to that. And I mean, of course, I'd want a South African film, or ideally, I want a film in Lesotho to be financed by Lesotho, you know, by the Lesotho National Film Fund, which doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you're done.
No, go ahead.
I was letting Seggen know that I wanted to say something.
Okay. Yeah. So as a filmmaker, I'm always adapting to the funding criteria. Okay. Well, sorry, I lost my thread there.
No, I understand. So you're kind of saying that depending on the funding, you have to make certain decisions. So if you want to have funding if you want to have enough money to make the film that you want to make, you kind of have to adapt your idea.
No, not the idea. You have to adapt the production structure.
Production structure. Okay.
Yeah, never the idea. You have to always keep the idea. You cannot, so I'll never adapt or change my idea according to where the money's from, but I will sort of renegotiate the production structure to make sure that I can fulfill certain criteria. But I was going to say that with documentary, it's a little bit easier because you don't have requirements like the actors have to speak French to get French money, So with documentary, you're sort of a little bit more free than with fiction film. So, I mean, that is one big advantage, I think.
Yeah, Tiny?
The other thing that I wanted to say is that the opposite is actually quite scary. The idea that a film from Lesotho will only be funded with Lesotho money, and a film from South Africa, and a film from Uganda, and a film from wherever. And actually, we have examples of what happens to national cinemas that are only funded by their states. And it's not a good example. So, I'm just inviting us to find another way of addressing this question.
Okay. Maia and Christopher, you, as you said before, you were kind of financed by DOK.fest, which is one of the first East African production companies. How did you get in touch with them, and how was that process kind of coming?
6 years ago, they put out a call, which was, first time East African Documentary Fund looking for projects, for documentary projects. So we applied, and then from the 12 projects, then it got cut down to 6. And then from there, they kind of supported us with development funding, and then also then with production funding. But throughout, they have, yes, they're receiving obviously their funds from outside. But they've been super supportive in terms of just the whole process from the beginning to the end, in terms of kind of financial, but also in terms of mentorship and workshops. And there's 2 people from DOK.fest who are exec producers on our film. But I think outside of that, also what's interesting is because there's such a growing number of documentary filmmakers now coming out of Kenya, it's creating this community, as we were talking about before, but a community where I think we're all kind of super eager to then kind of also pitch into other people's projects. So essentially, if it's not financial, I think there's also like a support network that's now slowly growing, that's just supporting one another more to be able to create good quality, great content that can be shown outside of Kenya, outside of the continent, and within also, of course. So I think that's, and I think then the last thing I want to say was patronage. I mean, as Africans, like, we're very good at always donating money to, whether it's family causes or whether it's like your neighbor's son or whatever it may be. And I think that now I'm really seeing this shift very slowly, but I'm seeing this shift in Kenya where you have people who are now starting to understand the idea of patronage for the arts. And I mean, it might not be a lot of money, but that kind of like thinking is definitely starting. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's also hugely important for us to be able to then also grow. So the financing can also come from people from the continent.
That would be like an interesting idea, finding patronage for your film, because that would also go into your own idea, and it would be maybe not tied to as many production details as other films.
That's what they do in the US all the time, no?
Yeah, I think more in the US because they don't have a lot of state funding, so they use more private billionaires' money or millionaires.
Tax deductible.
Yeah. So that's also like a really interesting thing to see that what's required for there to be more funding available in like across the continent is that we need to have more structured industries, right? But also the filmmaking has to be linked to many other sectors of the economy, like the legal sector to protect rights and intellectual property, like the finance sector in order to have tax breaks that are available for high income people to put money into films. Because at the end of the day, you know, we are slowly phasing out of capitalism, but it's not quite official yet. So in order to make these films, which cost a lot of money, and in order to have some of the financing coming from within the continent, we need to also think about how do we reach out and, well, first start by structuring our industries and then make our governments and our national treasuries recognize the financial potential of supporting the film industry, like growing in the continent.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one thing is that as a filmmaker, you kind of learn to become quite flexible, you know? You sort of have, say, one material and then you make 3 different products out of it, you know? You make kind of an art film or an NGO film and something else, you know?
It's great. So last year at DOK.fest Munich, we had this documentary called Talking About Trees. It's about 5 Sudanese filmmakers who are trying to put up a cinema in Sudan. And they're kind of, it shows their way to getting the cinema allowed by the state and how they kind of fail. But there would be an audience there. So a lot of people are like interested in them. What are you guys doing? They've been going out into community and trying to get people interested into their films. So, and what I hear also internationally, just in general, that it's harder to find an audience, maybe sometimes for documentary films than it is for fiction or for any other films that are maybe, or like not Netflix films. And how would you say, like, have you played your own films, for example, you in Lesotho, or have you had an opportunity to play in Kenya? And what should the conversation be about? How are we going to build kind of viewers or people get interested in documentaries in your own countries?
Well, in Lesotho, we have there's a mobile cinema, which we've been working with for a long time, which goes around the mountains and shows films. And I've made a few films about the cinema showing films, you know. So I really love this idea of a mobile cinema and showing stories that actually come from the communities in which it shows the films, you know. So that one's own stories are shown on the big screen, and that you really understand the power of documentary. And maybe that's one step to open up a wider audience to documentary filmmaking. And then there's the internet now. I mean, like when I grew up, you know, I didn't see that many documentaries because there was just, you know, there was no internet, you know. Mm-hmm. And I don't know.
So once you get access to get access to the documentaries, first of all.
Yeah.
I think so. We showed a group of older ladies our film the other day, and they just couldn't understand. I think it's also because we haven't been showing our own documentaries. They just couldn't understand that this wasn't a fiction film that was acted, you know. And they kept asking, like, "So, this? Are you sure this is not acted?" It's like, no, this is real life. And I think for them, they were in such shock that they were actually seeing like real life families going through these extremely personal scenarios and scenes, and them also being able to relate to it on such a raw level. It was something that was quite new and quite fresh that I hadn't experienced before. So that was really interesting. And then I've now forgotten what was your question?
I think it was about showing the film at home. Yeah. We haven't had a chance to show the letter in public yet. No. We had planned to premiere at MBO Film Fest in June, which is now being postponed or waiting to see how it all goes out. So we're kind of crushed that the film hasn't been seen in Kenya yet, because that's been our kind of most exciting prospect this whole time. And there is really a growing film watching community in Nairobi. It's like still like completely DIY and mainly around one festival and DocuBox again. But think there's a huge hunger and a huge desire for films made here to be seen here, and as well we have plans for a whole kind of
impact,
like grassroots traveling cinema, which we're really excited to be going around and have conversations around the film and around issues.
Yeah, we're looking at releasing now in October in Nairobi, and then across, like we're going to start at the coast with community screenings and discussions, and then from there, then take it around the country. So yeah.
But I guess without any established infrastructure in East Africa for kind of independent documentary, where pretty much just building our own distribution system and working with other filmmakers to try and work together to create those just pipelines of getting these films out there in front of people.
What I found beautiful is that you said that kind of people were excited to see their own stories or relatable stories on screen, which kind of fits into this whole bigger diversity conversation. But diversity doesn't inherently change structural issues. So that is one thing. Yeah, Tiny, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I mean, so Steps has over 25 years experience in showing films in community cinema or mobile cinema, what Teboho was describing. Besides Lesotho, we're showing cinemas in seven countries in Southern and Eastern Africa. And what we use is a mobile cinema tool, which is a backpack that is attached with a solar panel so that it's possible to screen films in remote and rural areas where there's no electricity. We also have a documentary platform called AfriDocs, which is a curated collection of documentaries, mostly from Africa, which are geo-blocked for Africa, which is Afridocs.net. So you can go online and watch documentaries from the continent. So the first that Maia spoke about is that for mobile cinema or community-based film screenings, it's really important for people to be seeing films which reflect their own experiences, their own life experiences, and that do this in a way that is from a perspective that is familiar, that is from a perspective, as in you can tell that the film is made by someone who knows this place, who knows this life, and who's invested in the story, right? So for mobile cinema, that's really important. And then on the AfriDocs platform, both on the online platforms where you can watch documentaries online, but also with the many broadcasters that we work with on the continent, there's a huge hunger for stories like that. There's a huge demand for stories like that. But there isn't a corresponding investment in making those films. And it is like a lot of work to create these audiences, whether it's mobile cinema or online or via broadcast, right? And but it's also, I think everyone on the panel will agree that it's really worthwhile and satisfying work to do. And there's a lot of work in that regard to do in firstly advocating for Africans to be able to make their own stories in documentary form, but also advocating for African audiences to be allowed the opportunity to watch these films, which we still don't get to watch, whether it's in rural communities via mobile cinema or whether it's on broadcasters that mostly or air cheap foreign material, and then whether it's online where there's still a struggle to bring audiences to online. So it's like work that is very much available for other people to join in.
I think I just would like to add the importance of film festivals for me personally, and this idea of having a kind of a building community and a concentrated viewing session. And I feel like especially now during this lockdown, I'm really missing that, So I've been spending a lot of time having a kind of private film festival with just one friend, we're only allowed to see one person. So we've been having a film festival for about 2 weeks now, where last night we watched films from about 8 till 2 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
And especially documentaries, it's so rewarding. It's such a, with documentaries, I feel like it's a bit like healthy food as opposed to fast food. Sometimes it's a bit more difficult to eat, but one always feels better afterwards, than watching Netflix or something. So I've been having this organic film watching sessions with a good friend of mine for the last 2 weeks.
And I think what also film festivals is maybe what all you guys said, you met on film festivals, so they can be a place to find co-production, to find maybe partners for your film. Doesn't mean like only financing, but helping you with certain aspects that maybe you're not as proficient in, or just giving you like ideas or other things that you can bounce off each other. So I think for the filmmaker community, film festivals are really important, even like especially also on the continent, not just like in Europe.
I think half my friends I've found at film festivals.
Yeah, and also like what's interesting now is like with COVID and with everyone staying home, it's like we've also been like opened up to so many more opportunities to actually meet other filmmakers, you know, like it's a Sundance cohort or it's the, you know, whatever it is, and actually like now there's these kind of new pods of different filmmakers from around the world that are kind of coming together also for the first time, which is also really interesting. So it is
on Zoom.
So it's super important, obviously, to have that physical connection, like live. Like Tiny and I were hanging out on a beach somewhere, like on our day off, and then Teboho, we were part of Hot Dogs together, Hot Dogs Blue Ice. So it's just both the connections actually have been interesting, different, but both important.
Well, there is something though that's lacking in the Zoom thing, right? I mean, like the festival experience of spending time with someone, getting to know them, and then going to go watch the film is really wonderful, you know?
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent so many years in the festival environment. I used to work for the Durban International Film Festival, and like Teboho, most people that I know I've met through festivals. So, and also professionally, festivals have been such a rewarding space for me. And I've also been able to see how festivals have been able to be rewarding for other filmmakers. And as an industry event, I think it's great if you can get in, right? And this is, I think, what we need to interrogate as a community while we're offline now. When we get back to real life, how can we work more to make festival spaces more inclusive and to bring more people in? That is to say that I think there's definitely a lot more people watching this than if it had happened in Munich.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So kind of the digital, like globalization, the digital era is kind of a leveler on some point, but it doesn't give you everything a real festival would like give you. We have,
but I think that this experience of it is this taste of having access to so many more people and so many more voices and so on is something that we could work harder in translating into the in real life reality that's waiting for us after Corona.
Yeah. We have a question from the audience. It says, very interesting discussion. Do you see new film festivals in making in Africa? Also, since DOK.fest addresses the economic influence of the Chinese, is there also cultural support by the Chinese for filmmaking? Maybe the first part of the question, do you know any new film festivals in the making on the continent?
I can say that NBO Film Fest in Nairobi is definitely a new and upcoming festival.
It's in its third year, I think. Our good friends Mbithi and Shiba, both filmmakers and film producers, music producers, starting this up, and it's definitely created a kind of new
buzz
culture that's kind of crossing over into kind of mass culture, pop culture. It's definitely exciting for us here in Nairobi, having a festival.
Yeah.
After going to South Africa and seeing the festivals down there, we're kind of blown away. Oh well, this exists on the continent. We've never had anything like that in Nairobi, so we're trying to catch up.
Yeah,
that's good. And do you know of any cultural support by the Chinese for filmmaking? I guess for African filmmaking, not for Chinese filmmaking.
No, I know that there is CCTV funds some sort of TV reportages, I think, and a few friends of mine kind of do that. I don't know, you seem to be nodding there. Perhaps, you know, some people kind of get paid to make short documentaries for CCTV, I think. No, is it CCTV?
Yeah, used to be. They changed it. CGN now? Oh no, what's it called? They changed the name.
Yeah.
It was a bit ominous, I suppose.
Yeah. So yeah, but I had this idea of finding lots of Chinese money for my film, but it never really happened. But I think what my film also shows that that the influence or the kind of the what's happening with the Chinese in Africa it is a purely economic interest that the families or the people that I've been filming with have there, and there is very little curiosity of cultural curiosity. So, and I've been thinking about this a lot because the Chinese that I was working with in Lesotho and Teboho, they have built themselves a camp in the middle of the mountains, and it's a bit like a kind of a container ship, parked on the top of a mountain, and the goods kind of flow out and money comes in, but no one ever leaves this place because there is no cultural interaction between the communities, and that is, why it's because why it is like that, I'm not sure, but I see that there is a slight change, and I see that some Chinese families are settling for the long term, and so this might change.
Mm-hmm. I definitely know that in Eritrea, for example, there's like a Chinese cultural fund, but it's for kind of promoting Chinese culture in East Africa, in Eritrea. That kind of the same as that is Institut Français or the Goethe Institute for Germany. That's what I know they have in Eritrea or in some other African countries. So it's more about promoting, or I would say promoting their culture or bringing their culture closer to people on the continent. We talked about audiences or building audiences. When you make a film, do you have a certain audience in mind, or do you just kind of as much people or as many people as possible, I would love for them to see it? Or do you think, or I would love to make this movie for these people? Maybe Maya and Christopher, you start.
I think there's a couple of different, so once we met the grandma from the film, I think clearly this grandma who had so much strength and spirit and energy, and clearly she was not a witch, clearly. So I think for me, essentially when we were talking to her before we started filming, it was okay, so I think for me is how do we make this film essentially for the elders who are going through this pain and fear for their lives, being accused of being witches, and so I think that was one part of it, was how can we kind of make this film and show that this woman and essentially many other elderly people are not witches. And I think then also it's, I think because our first film, it was kind of a slight trial and error, but it was mainly for Kenyans, wider Kenyans, also for an international audience. I think was important for us for the first film. Also financially, getting funding, as Teboho said, from all of these different area codes.
But I don't think that ever shaped the film that we made so much. No. I think it was interesting, because the film centers around a family dispute, we actually made a lot of iterations of the film that we would show to the family, and a lot of the way the film came together came about how it became used as a kind of mediation tool between these disputing family members. So at some points the audience was just 6 people for the film, and for a long while we weren't even sure if the film would get out to the wider world because it dealt with such sensitivities of this single family. So it kind of shape-shifted a lot of times, and I don't think we ever thought about what would a Nairobi audience want, or what would a Munich audience want. But I guess we just thought what does this story need? What is the real life telling us, and what do we follow? And then in the editing room, it was really just down to what was most compelling and kind of pure for the story, to tell the best story possible, basically.
Yeah, I know it sounds a bit puristic, but I really try not to think about the audience at all when I make my films. I think if one is in I think ideally one should try to create a space in which the focus is the film and just the film, the crafting of the film, and the producer or the distributor can worry about the audience. But for me, I really try not to be influenced by that at all, if possible.
Okay. We have this, it's called Follow the Nile. It's a project with the Robert Bosch Stiftung, which is kind of a Pan-Africanist film project. You can say they're trying to connect the East and Northern African film market. So we have 2 film teams that are also working at the DOK.fest in Munich here. And I've kind of figured out that for young filmmakers coming up, or like newer filmmakers in African countries, what some of them said is that they don't know any of the structure, like especially when you didn't go to a film school, which you don't inherently have, is what would be like your tips for young filmmakers? Where could you get connections? Where could you get like they had, for example, one mentoring session with Don Edkins, so you're that, and then afterwards they were like, oh my god, he knows everything, like he knows where to go, like
he does know everything.
But for them it was like a great way to get a start into the industry. So maybe you have some tips as well. Anyone?
Tiny.
I have not made it as a documentary director, but I'll give it a go. Firstly, just before I talk about this, how to make it in documentary, you asked a question earlier about festivals in Africa. I work I curate the Durban Film Arts, which is the industry program, like a co-production market, all things in South Africa. So a lot of my colleagues across the continent who we work in the festival space, it's a really difficult time. So I wanted to give a shout out and say, hey, we will overcome. And and also to just also make the note that festivals are really difficult to find and to get off the ground and to keep going everywhere on the continent. And it's really, really serious work. And that in a situation where we can't bring people into the same room and experience the thing like cinema together, it's a really scary, scary time. And that, just a shout out to everyone who's making festivals happen anyway. Then about I went to a film school here in South Africa, and it taught me very little. It taught me very little about what I'm going to do once I get the certificate. I had no idea, right? And actually the thing that saved me was community. And I think besides whether you're going to go to a film school or whether you're going to go on YouTube and learn the technical things that have to do with cameras and editing, and learn the technical things that have to do with story and narrative convention, whether you're doing that on YouTube or you're doing that in a film school, it has the same value. But once you've done learning all those things, I think the best way to figure out everything is to just go out there and find people. Find them online like this, and then make the effort to talk to them all the time about your filmmaking, about their filmmaking, about filmmaking in general. And this is the extra learning, but also along the way, you get to find out these structures and so on. And then obviously there's also the internet, but I really feel that people will give you the best kind of information. They will give you more than what's on the website. They'll tell you whether it's worth your time or how to approach it and so on. And I think if more people come out of film school with that kind of ethos, it'll help us to build a more supportive industry where we work more as a community, and we do that. So just talk to people, and like there's nothing to be scared of. People everybody wants to meet the people who graduated last year.
That's nice.
Yeah, I think to add to that is just like that sense of community. I think is so important. I think that is like a number one, like a big one. And I think also I think it's just that thing where you just have to go out and just try and do it. If it's if you can borrow a camera from somebody, if you have a camera, is just go out and if it's directing that you want to do or producing, whatever it is, but being able to just engage in whatever you want to try and do and just experiment. And I think those opportunities, I mean, I can't speak for SA or for anywhere else, but I think those opportunities in Kenya for like young filmmakers to be able to create like little short films on their phone or camera or whatever it is becoming like pretty popular. And I think just through those kinds of things and understanding more about this kind of documentary space and potential kind of tapping into like financing things and community on top of all that, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I think the main thing is just the doing. I think that was always the hard thing at film school, because I guess you've got a huge institution around you and people, but when you're out and it's just you and a camera, how do you, like where do you go, who do you speak to, what do you do? And that the only way to get better at your craft is just to keep making stuff, whether it's like 2 minutes long or 90 minutes long or whatever, and find those people that you can show it to and that you can get like critical but constructive feedback, and just learn about these networks that exist. We're amazed to learn about these different funds and these different networks, and also to realize how open people were to being approached. And I know, like as filmmakers, and we've always been given I guess a leg up by people wanting to grow an industry, and we have an interest in there being more filmmakers getting better at what they do. So anytime someone reaches out to us in any way, we're always available, and it's amazing how you keep going up to like amazing stratospheric levels of filmmaking, and people are constantly available. So just paying that forward is like really important.
And watch films. I think create communities and collectives and watch films together and talk about films. I think I really think that helps. I mean, there's so much out there. If there, I mean, I have like 6 or 7 different online festivals or websites right now that I'm trying to watch, and it really helps me to watch it with somebody. Watching together, talk about it, and I choose a film, then he chooses a film, and I choose a film, and we learn from each other that way. Yeah.
There was a question about the film school landscape in Kenya and South Africa. Are there only in the capitals, so Nairobi, or is there like a more spread out film school landscape? Do you guys know that?
I mean, I know that there's like a couple of different pockets, and in Nairobi, I think there's 2 or 3 different kind of film schools or film spaces where you've got filmmakers who are also just sharing their craft. And then I know in Kibra and Kibera, there's like a Slum TV, I think it's called, where they're also like honing in young filmmakers and teachings. Outside of Nairobi, I really don't know. I haven't
heard of like most of them are like multimedia schools or design schools, and I guess film production is taught. But as far as like a traditional film school where you're kind of taught like cinema to a degree, that doesn't so much exist yet in Kenya. Our film school here has been mainly working with other filmmakers and people who've been working in the industry for a long time, and that's really how kind of we're able to cut our teeth. And YouTube. So.
Many hours on YouTube.
Great. When I look at your films, so for example, you Teboho, you grew up in Lesotho, your film plays in Lesotho. For you, Maia and Chris, you live in Kenya and your film plays in Kenya. And you also said, Tiny, that your project, there are 17 filmmakers that are they're like making their films in their own countries. Do you think that is important, and that if a foreigner would come, for example, to Kenya, to Lesotho, if they could make a documentary in the same quality, or if it will always be different? Whoever wants to start.
Tiny?
Yes, guys, sure, I'll go. I think it's very tricky if you're speaking from a filmmaker who's from Africa, living in Africa, and whose kind of space to work in film is like in Africa. To think and talk through what does it mean for filmmakers from outside of Africa to come into Africa and make films, whereas there isn't an opportunity for me to make a film about reindeer hunting in Finland. You check. Right. But at the same time, there's something very interesting culturally in terms of like growing into a better understanding of each other across the world if we open up opportunities for us to make films in different parts of the world and for us to experiment with ways of seeing each other and ways of being seen, as it were. Be that as it may, I think it's even more important that we support filmmakers in the remotest parts of the world, or people who are storytellers in the remotest part of the world, to have the access to the resources to make films about their life experiences. So while it's interesting to see how other people make films and tell stories about us, that story is not complete unless we have more of the stories made by those same people as a testimony to their existence.
Mm-hmm. I think I'd answer the question in for me, it's not about, if a film is better or not, or but I think if you make a film, you have a responsibility to be as honest about the filmmaking process as you can be, and negotiate your own position as the filmmaker towards people you're filming with, and that applies to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, no, that's.
Yeah, I think that, of course, like a foreigner will never be able to make a film with like the same legitimacy that someone like from that area will be able to make, but also different perspectives can always be interesting. I mean, I'm from Australia. I grew up in Australia. I came to Kenya 2007. It really wasn't, and kind of took me really 8 years of living in Kenya before I felt I could even begin to start to like create anything with any real legitimacy. And that came with learning a language. It came with 8 years of reading and interacting and unpacking so many things that if you were just to come in, paratroop into a community with a camera, it's like it's a really difficult thing to have proper empathy for and understand the context of what you're dealing with. So I think as long as that's taken incredibly seriously, then good things can come.
Yeah, and I think also because like as Chris says, is that Chris has learned Kiswahili. We both speak Swahili, and because essentially like it was in my backyard, it was easy for us to tell the story. And because also like there's this kind of interesting balance between, and I don't know how to say it in any other way, but there's this kind of like excitement of seeing a white person where actually you get very different sides of the story in different ways, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. And I think that also in some ways, like we couldn't have gotten some of the access if Chris hadn't been there. Then that sounds really like psychologically crazy, but there is that also plays. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think as well, when you're living in a space, a lot of things become invisible to you, and it's coming into a space with like a new perspective. At least you're a lot more also, I guess, just super sensitive to things that haven't become invisible for you yet because they've just become normal. So there's also that denormalization that can also come from coming from a different space.
Mm-hmm. We have another audience question. Is there any possibility that you could describe your experience or the journey of your documentary? And is there a reason that there are 3 documentary DOK.fest festival? I guess the second one is the Africa Day always presents 3 documentaries that are normally, if it would be a real life festival in Munich, are played after each other, and in between or at the end, mostly we would have this discussion with the audience in real life. So that's why there are 3. And I think the number is because more than 3 documentaries in one day is a lot for an audience to take in. But the first part will be for you. Is there, how could you describe your experience or the journey of your documentary? So I guess it means like, how was the filmmaking journey, maybe?
Intense, always.
I mean, you got locked up at the end, so.
Yeah, I ended up in hospital, but I think the more intense the journey is, the better the film usually. The more you give yourself, the more exhausted you are. I don't really know, because I mean the film Cannibalism took 6-7 years to make, because a lot of it was waiting for funding or researching material and so on. So there are many different moments within the process. But a lot of things happened to me as well in the last year in my personal life, which changed me as well. So, and sometimes you can't say that this is the film, this is you. But so my answer to the question is, if the more intense, the more powerful the film, or if a film has a great effect on you personally, then usually you're doing a good job.
I think the thing with documentary filmmaking is it's not like a fiction film, maybe, that you have like 90 days and then you shoot it in 90 days with everyone there at the stage. But as you guys said, yours took 6 years, I think, as well, Maia and Chris. So the stories accompany you a long time, the people accompany you a long time. So it's a different process of making the film. Maybe you have other projects probably at the same time.
And you change as well, obviously, your life changes, the people's lives whom you work with change. There's lots of different winds of there's just so many different things happening in these.
Yeah.
We filmed for 2 years, I think, before we actually started capturing things that are actually in the film. We spent a lot of time just like, dare I say, garbage collecting. But I mean, we knew there was something that was like extremely fascinating. We didn't know what, we didn't know why, but somehow we were compelled to just keep getting on a bus and traveling 800 kilometers to an area where we would stay for 3-4 weeks at a time. We loved being there. We loved the people we were meeting. And then just eventually whatever was happening started to present itself, and we just had to make sure we were there and that we were ready to record when things were happening. And we didn't know what would be interesting to other people. I mean, and that was what was so hard about the editing process. But just being an experience, and we just knew that, I don't know, our guts were telling us that this was worth doing. But looking back as well, it's like, what were we doing? It's kind of strange to think.
Learning process.
Yeah, and this is also our film school, so
yeah. But I think just to add on to that, is that I think it was one of those things where we didn't really know what we were doing, and actually we knew there was something, but like there was like a lot of interviews and kind of like there was a wider social issue, but we hadn't actually tapped into like the thing that was going to relate our film to people all over. And it was only like after 2 years when we met the grandma who lives across the road from my family in this one particular area that we actually hadn't, anyway, we were meandering a bit. And it was from there that we were then able to get her personal story, which people can relate to across the world.
And we're just available to complete coincidences happening and complete like strokes of luck that ended up with us in the middle of certain situations that became the kind of hallmark scenes of the film. So yeah, just winging it basically.
Tiny, what is the process of your production right now? How are you getting all these movies together, these clips from the 17 different countries and filmmakers?
So firstly, I am doing this sort of thing for the very first time. I work with Edkins, who is the person who started Steps and who is like a vastly experienced producer with like a kind of a unique approach to producing, which is producing a kind of collection of films which are produced together to be presented to an audience together for like higher and greater impact. So we have we've been working for the last 2 years together since we started doing the call out for projects. We started with 45 stories, and we did story development workshops with documentary filmmaking experts from Africa and the rest of the world, in which we were going through a process of interrogating what stories about migration exist in the world. So we also brought in journalists and writers and artists from the regions that we had the workshops. So it was Accra in English-speaking West Africa, Ouagadougou in French-speaking West Africa, and Nairobi in East Africa, in which we also invited experts from IOM in order to find out what was there and what was their possibility to make challenging narratives from. After this, we selected about 35 projects that we supported with mentors or professional supporters to help them to structure their narrative in the development process, as well as resources to be able to get a camera and work with the DOP to go and shoot some visual material, to do some research, come up with a kind of an approach to telling the story. So from those 35 projects, we went with 30 that we are now in a process of supporting, firstly in securing international co-productions in order to make the films and find global audiences for them. We're supporting them in actually working in financing the projects, but also in working in financing a kind of a system of professional support where each of these filmmakers who a lot of them making films in isolation in their countries, and a lot of documentary filmmakers to work with. So we're connecting them with highly experienced documentary filmmakers that work to kind of support them professionally in structuring the narratives, and also a process that when we go into post-production after Corona, we will also have editors giving support in the post-production process, helping filmmakers to think through films and to talk about the films that they're making, because that's also a very important part of kind of challenging yourself creatively, but also challenging yourself ethically, which is a very important thing as well in documentary filmmaking. So we work with these production companies and support them in all the production things that are needed. And after this, we will work with them in making sure these films reach audiences in Africa, obviously, but also everywhere in the world.
Do you know how, like, when will the project be finished, around the time? When can audiences see it?
We had really hoped to deliver these films by May next year, but because of Corona and most of our productions having to kind of be put on hold for the safety of our crew, but also because, you know, interruptions, we're not sure anymore what that will be, but we hope that May will still be something that we can deliver on. Yeah.
That sounds great. I can read some of the feedback from the audience. There's one: it's so great to have this conversation. Wish we could be together in a place, but grateful to have it here, from Don Edkins. And then there's one from: thank you very much for this great panel. The opportunity to watch film across the continent and learn from each other is very important for Pan-Africanism. To kind of add to that, we talked about film festivals before, and I just kind of realized or got reminded there's always this retrospective where you look at filmmakers, and mostly male, mostly Western filmmakers, and then you look at maybe 10 of their great pieces. I have never really seen retrospective from African filmmakers, especially African documentary filmmakers. Do you think that this kind of history, the film history, gets lost? Or is there a way that we can like kind of keep it up?
So, I mean, I think, can I answer?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think this also comes down to a question of platform. Do you mean a retrospective in Africa? of African cinema?
In general, in like all over the world, where normally, or in a lot of film festivals, I know they have like retrospective of filmmakers, but
all right,
little representation of African filmmakers in those retrospectives outside of Africa as well.
Sure. I mean, I think I'm not able to answer about outside of Africa, but I will make note that the Black Light, the retrospective that came out last year, I think Lekow, that was really amazing. It wasn't about Africa; it was about Black films, but like that was interesting, and I think it's worth just saying that was really nice to see. But also to say that a lot of the archives of African films are like compromised. So there's a project which is kind of the patron of is Martin Scorsese, of restoring African prints in order to make them available. So a lot of the prints that are there are not accessible to a lot of programmers and curators in Africa in order to do really extensive retrospectives. But again, I think it's worth noting that there are a lot of film festivals across the continent which do curate some retrospectives of African cinema. Not as extensive as what we are all hungry for because of all of these constraints, but there is a huge desire and constant attempts from curators and festivals in Africa to make sure that we show our canon of African cinema.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I think Maia and Chris, isn't your next project about a library archive?
Yeah, it's about an old colonial library downtown Nairobi, and these two young women are trying to revitalize and decolonize the space. And we know them well; we've known them for many years. But yeah, I mean, there's so many kind of different facets to this kind of capsule of time that hasn't changed over the last 50 years, and it's full of books by white authors, male authors, and like I think there was like 2 from African authors. Chinua Achebe, actually, I think they were both from him. So I mean, it's been an interesting journey, and we've been filming for 2 years. And how do we kind of tell this story? How do we then, tell the story of the city and the kind of contemporary city, but with this kind of capsule within it? So yeah,
and I guess there's always been that power structure which is determined who gets the access to resources and equipment that's needed to tell these stories, and those power structures at the moment are being completely kind of overthrown, and now new access to technology and of course online means that so many, at least young people in Nairobi, are picking up a Canon 5D and making short films. Most of the exciting stuff happening in cinema in Kenya, documentary or fiction, they're all young directors making their first or second feature. So we don't have that kind of that kind of established like history yet, so we can't even have like a retrospective so much on like Kenyan filmmakers. So much of the industry here is being based on like foreign films coming, and a lot of the industry is just a fixing industry. So actually now like storytellers from Kenya putting films together, it's coming waves, but like the current wave, it's still new and it's still fresh. So maybe in 10 years we can start to have these retrospectives of Kenyan directors, which would be an exciting time.
Also, I was just thinking, maybe there's something wrong with the question asking about in the way you use the term documentary, because what does documentary mean in Africa? One has to kind of understand that there's or look for a filmmaking style or a voice or filmmaking language that comes from the continent, or or from particular places. So maybe a certain type of Nollywood cinema which mixes fiction and documentary is in a way documentary, So one shouldn't kind of look for some classical, French observational documentary. Of course, it's not there, but there's plenty of other voices and languages that are being created.
Thank you so much for all your contributions. We're kind of coming to an end. I have one last question. If there would be anything that you could kind of add right now to the African film scene, to the industry, or if there is anything you could change, or that could be made accessible? What is like your one wish? You can also have two wishes.
I think from here, I think one of the main things is like support from the governmental organizations that's been put there to support filmmakers. I mean, I won't go into too much detail, but currently we have somebody who doesn't really understand film, who's in charge of our film section, and who's clamping down a lot on certain films that are being made, some justified points, others not. So I think it's just kind of having like the governmental body that is able to support our films and be able to potentially fund our films
and
value them, for them to go much further than they are going.
Because I think the audiences are there. I think there's a huge hunger, there's a huge desire. It's just establishing those kind of distribution channels and a wider culture of cinema going and anticipating the next films coming out of here. But it's at the moment the challenge is kind of like a top-down like challenge.
Who wants to go next?
Okay, panel chicken. Do you want to go, Teboho?
No, you go.
Okay, so I really like Maia's wish, so I won't waste my wish on the same thing, but I wish that for the whole continent. My first one, because I get more than one, would be for more support for initiatives, like even entrepreneurial initiatives that allow us to grow audiences for African content. I think it's a very brutal business landscape for anyone who wants to make the service of bringing content to audiences in Africa. So more support for platforms that are working to, identify African content and find a space for it. That's the one. And I think the other would be more funding available for documentary specifically in Africa. And I think if we grow audiences for documentary, then funding will follow.
So more cinemas, more films,
more
audiences,
more films,
more audience, more cameras,
more everything. Okay, thank you so much. I definitely learned a lot. I hope our audience did as well. As I said, we're going to end this little panel discussion with a song from The Letter, the film. Maia, if you want to quickly say something. I think you introduced it in the video as well, but if you just want to give a context, and when does the soundtrack come out as well, so we can all listen to it.
So this song is called Miembe. I did intro it in the video, and I mean, it's pretty much just kind of the story, which Miembe means under the mango tree, and it's the story of this grandma and her kind of fearless spirit. Anyway, I already said that. But making the soundtrack is going to be released probably in the next 2 weeks. Where are we at?
29th of May.
29th of May. Thank you very much. And yeah.
It'll be available on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, everywhere. So yeah, keep an eye out.
Well, thank you so much. Then let's play it now.
Greetings from Nairobi. My name is Maia Lekow. And this song that I'm going to be singing to you is called Miembe, which in Kiswahili means under the mango tree. And I composed this song for my first feature-length documentary that I directed along with my husband, Chris King. And this song is about a grandma with a fearless spirit who spends many of her days down in her farm, plowing and growing food to provide for her family. And she's been accused of being a witch by other family members, and this is the one place that she finds solace. And she always sits under the mango tree.
those old hands have worked this land. Home, bore healthy children. Dawn has broken, shadows go into hiding, whispers float carelessly in the wind. Kwenye kiosk kanisani, matangani mamangweni. Kwenye kiosk kanisani, matangani mamangweni. Chini ya miembe, chini ya miembe, she sits. By a little light, by a little night, Kimya, for all these years, only now crows scratch, but they fly away. Kwenye kiosk kanisani, matangani mamangweni. Kwenye kiosk kanisani, matangani mamangweni. Chini ya miembe. And don't you worry, sit under the mango tree. And don't you worry, sit under the mango tree. And don't you worry, don't you worry. Thank you.